Hello, my name is Michaelina Argy, and this presentation is on urbanisation and public health in the 18th and 19th centuries. This video looks at urban development and public health in the 18th century, then the causes, impacts, and the attempt to address public health problems in the 19th century. In the 18th century, with the rapid growth in industrial technologies due to the Industrial Revolution, people were moving from rural society to places where there was perceived employment and hence greater wealth than they had when they were living on the land. All this rapid urban growth was unplanned. Houses were built quickly with no thoughts of sanitation or of decent living conditions. They lived not just in close proximity beside each other, but due to inadequate housing, they were living on top of each other. Poor sanitation, disease spread rapidly. Crime became prevalent among the poor, and these places also became high fire risk hazards due to the narrow streets which prevented firefighters from reaching burning properties. Not everyone moved to slum housing. Those who had money could afford to live in homes that had space and windows for ventilation and light, some even with sanitation. But for the majority of the working class families, life was not so good for them in the cities than it had been in the villages. The government scientists and philanthropists all attempted to resolve these problems. Different acts were passed through Parliament, some of which were just add-ons to previous acts and made little difference. Others were life-changing, and all these together had an impact on the public health problems in the 19th century. Urban growth occurs when large numbers of people move to an area due to perceived benefits, whether they be economical or social. Industries then grow up around them. But what has pulled them there in the first place? The Enclosures Act of the 16th century meant commoners, the poor people of the rural communities, did not have the common land anymore to farm. The Act of 1801 permitted landowners to put up fences to parcel up and to keep trespassers off their land. Not being able to graze their animals and grow their own crops between the land parcels anymore, they needed to go and live where they could afford the food that landowners and large farmers were selling. Hunger and a perceived better life drove many people to the towns looking for work. Better farming practices, which included crop rotation, new irrigation techniques, and new types and styles of crops, improved the food and it became more available. With this, the population grew healthier, decreasing the mortality rate and increasing the birth rate. Figures taken from the National Statistics Quality Review claim the population more than doubled from the middle of the 18th century into the middle of the 19th century. Families were growing, assisted by those surviving past those early years into adulthood. This led to massive growth in the rural population, where there was now not enough work, causing unemployment and poverty. This in part created the mass movement of people looking for better economic and social opportunities in the towns. So in summary, around the early 1700s, 80% of people were living in agrarian societies and due to perceived benefits elsewhere began moving to the towns. This increased population to the towns created a new workforce of people to fill the new factories that were being developed, and this burst of growth created many issues that the town planners needed to consider to enable the healthy and prosperous development of these towns. And new problems did begin to arise. Disease was prevalent, markedly smallpox. It was estimated that between 20% to 60% of all cases contracting smallpox were fatal in the 18th century, and up to 80% of all children in urban areas contracting smallpox died. However, the invention of the smallpox vaccine by Edward Jenner made a radical difference to the increase in population. Crime grew greatly as there was a great divide between those who had wealth and those who did not. Property theft from the wealthy was common, as well as murder and street robbery. Prostitution increased, as did rape, all in the name of poverty. Policing at this time was not adequate enough for the influx of people arriving, and it took until the middle of the 18th century before the first police form was formed, the Bow Street Runners. But the real cause of all crime was poverty, and the diseases poverty brought were very dramatic for so many in the 18th century. During this period, town planning was being poorly regulated. Houses crammed in as many people as possible. Whilst this housed the majority of the poor, there was no thought of comfort or hygiene. They were built so close together that many narrow streets were not even the width of wagons. Those streets were wide enough, eventually caused traffic congestion with horses, cows and sheep travelling through. Wagons were also increasing volume as more people were beginning to travel to work. With nobody in charge of sanitation or street planning, the streets became polluted with the excrement, not just from the animals but from humans too, as they threw their rubbish and effluents out into the open street. Excrement found its way into the Thames in London, polluting the main source of drinking water. Families were growing, and the atrocious living conditions of the poor caused disease to spread among the population like wildfire. Added to this, there was water and air pollution due to the expulsion of the fumes of the Industrial Revolution's new technologies. So in the early 18th centuries, the growing towns of Britain were characterised by poverty, overcrowding, atrocious housing, and disease caused by pollution and lack of hygiene generated from poor living conditions. The belief had been for centuries that disease needed piety and prayer to recover, but it was noted that isolation and quarantining was also a measure of containment of disease, which had been observed during the plague. There were general public hospitals, which were a form of containment of disease. This was the best public health available then. Medicine was making slow progress. Doctors still did not know what caused disease, and some continued to believe in the pseudoscience of the four humours seen here in this diagram, although belief in this theory rapidly declined during the 18th century. But the public health was seen to be the responsibility of local governments, which included keeping the towns clean and free of crime. Early in the 18th century, the lack of connection between germs and disease caused most of the health problems for the people. All this rapid growth and urban spread was unplanned, which continued and grew into the 19th century. With not enough homes for everyone, new houses were being built quickly with no consideration to ventilation or even for comfort for the inhabitants. Windows were usually fixed closed or there were none at all. As can be seen in this picture here, it illustrates many of the problems involved for those living in the worst poverty. Many of the rooms were small. The numbers of people inhabiting these rooms were numerous, with mixed ages and with mixed sexes. Different families shared these small spaces, and so they were all living in close proximity with one another. This type of living meant that anyone getting ill would spread it quickly among the other inhabitants. They were likely working in equally shameful and atrocious conditions in their factories, thus spreading the disease further afield. However, not everyone lived like this in the 19th century. The gentry lived in large houses with good ventilation. They had staff to keep their homes clean, their bodies and their clothes clean too. They lived in fresh, airy, leafy boulevards with their own water supplies and their own privies, which were still outside until the middle of the 19th century and were still flushing straight into the River Thames in London. The difference between the rich and the poor were very dramatic, and the wealthy, the landowners and the voters, and these were the people who made up the government, they could not begin to comprehend what was happening to the majority of the working people living in this new world of rapid urbanisation. The very ignorance of these people compounded the problems of public health. In the middle of the 19th century, cholera emerged once again, and it was pandemic all over the world. A waterborne disease that was prevalent everywhere, although it was still believed that it was carried through the miasma theory in a cloud vapour. In 1854, more than 23,000 people died from cholera alone. John Snow discovered in the 1850s that the source of cholera was coming from a communal water pump. Until this discovery, thousands of people died from this disease. The lack of understanding that this is a waterborne disease and the sharing by so many people of water pumps and cramped living quarters spread this disease far and wide. As it was the poor who appeared to be suffering more than the wealthy, it was believed that it was a punishment from God for the sins of the poor, and so the government still didn't do a lot about it. Other diseases prevalent in the 19th century included tuberculosis, which infected 70 to 90% of urban populations. This interestingly is carried through the air by coughs and sneezes, validating part of the miasma theory. Typhus and smallpox were also contagious. In the latter half of the century, the understanding of disease and the inventions of vaccinations did slow down the rapid spread of these diseases. The new industrial technologies and machinery of steam and coal that were being used were pumping out major pollution, causing acid rain and smog. Smog is a type of fog caused by atmospheric pollutants and can be dangerous when breathed in for too long, causing respiratory diseases. All major cities where there was industrialisation suffered from the ill effects of smog. Not just the factories of the Industrial Revolution were pumping out their noxious fumes, but the chimneys of the homes which were warmed with coal fires were pumping out pollution as well. Acid rain was being produced mainly from the LeBlanc soda factory. Sodium carbonate was being made for use in making glass, detergents and soaps. These factories not only released vast amounts of waste, they were also expelling hydrochloric acid into the atmosphere, causing damage to everything that was touched by it. Houses were being tarnished, farmlands and trees were dying, and people were suffering nausea, coughs and general unwellness. It was Robert Angus Smith, the Scottish chemist, in 1858 connected acid rain to the atmospheric pollution from being produced by these factories. Due to the public health problems these factories were causing, the first Alkali Act was passed in 1863, of which he was the chief inspector. And then the second Alkali Act of 1874 is the basis still used for air pollution policies today and aims to control the release of damaging pollutants into the atmosphere. With the smog, acid rain and the rubbish being thrown into the streets along with the effluents being spilled into the Thames, 1858 became known as the Great Stink. From June to August, the pollution in the Thames fermented during the heat wave of that summer. This prompted the building of London sewer system by Joseph Basil Getty, ordered by Parliament. However, in local areas, the responsibility of public health was localised to local authorities. There was no backup or support from Parliament, and there was not enough money or will to make any necessary and lasting changes. The 5 main points that made the cities of the 19th century so unhealthy were the poor housing, the dirt, waste, unclean water, and disease. The lack of knowledge of dirt and disease compounded public health problems. However, in 1866, the last cholera outbreak only affected those where clean water was not provided, where public health improvements had not been made. This strengthened the effect and understanding between health and hygiene. In 1867, when working class men got the vote, this forced local councils to take action. The causes of disease and poor public health were finally being recognised by government by the latter half of the 19th century. With With all the problems arising from rapid urbanisation, public health became a very important factor for some people who were not themselves suffering the misfortunes of poverty. Charity had for centuries existed, with the wealthy giving to the poor via institutions like the church, which was a major giver of charity. Always connected to God, sometimes these charities did not reach all the people in need of help. There were many philanthropists at this time. Disease and public health were in urgent need of addressing, with the abject poverty for more than 1/4 of its inhabitants. This enabled those people who found themselves in a position to be able to do something to help change the view of government and its responsibility to all of its people. All of them had talent, perseverance, tenacity, vision, empathy, understanding, compassion, and strategic thinking. These individuals spoke in Parliament, making changes to the law. Despite hostility and indifference, they persevered and helped create the welfare state we have the privilege to live in today. Their changes for the people then and their lives were enormous even in those times, and here is a list of just a few of them, in birth order, because all held a vital piece of the puzzle in changing urbanising Britain from one of the worst places for the poor to live into the modern world we live in today. Jeremy Bentham supported equal rights for women, abolition of slavery and the death penalty, the right for divorce and the separation of the church and the state. His many articles and views trickled their way into the 1834 Reform Act. Sir Edwin Chadwick's ideas were based around social and health improvements. Targeting sanitation, housing and clean water supplies, he wrote the Chadwick Report, which the Liberals in 1847 adopted in the first Public Health Act, but this was not enforceable. John Stuart Mill was a utilitarian. He published many writings in support of this, promoting free speech, demanding education and birth control be compulsory and equality for women. When he was an MP in Parliament, he participated actively in debates preceding the 1867 Reform Bill and pushed through many modifications of that bill, preventing corrupt practices. The 1867 Reform Act meant that men in urban areas who met the property qualification were enfranchised, and the Act roughly doubled the electorate in England and Wales from 1 to 2 million men. William Rathbone realised that the poor had no understanding of health. He started district nursing as an organised movement, and by 1875 he was an MP, and with this position was able to advocate these changes where his voice was heard and action could be made. Florence Nightingale revolutionised medical care in Great Britain, improving hygiene practices and thus reducing mortality rates. Her impact on nursing helped women from higher social and wealthy classes engage in nursing, as it was then becoming seen as an honourable vocation. Louisa Twining helped establish a home for workhouse girls so they did not have to live in the workhouse anymore. In 1867, an act was passed separating infirmaries from workhouses, and in 1879 she established the Workhouse Infirmary Nursing Association. William Booth became the leader of the Christian Mission, which in 1878 was renamed as the Salvation Army. Its work was done by taking God's work outside of the church directly to the people. They tackled issues that worked at the very heart of communities, offering unconditional assistance. This work continues today by the Salvation Army and has spread around the world. Thomas John Barnardo devoted himself to helping children who lived in poverty after seeing children sleeping in gutters and on roofs in the East End. He set up what was known as a ragged school, which was a type of school providing free education, food, clothing and lodging for those who could not afford to pay. He believed in children being brought up in families, so he boarded children out, which was the beginning of fostering. George Robert Sims dramatised the suffering of Londoners. The monologue of the Dragonette Ballads, It is Christmas Day in the Workhouse, gave a strong voice towards social concern and creating public sentiment. The many papers and articles he wrote led to reform legislation in the Act of 1885, where sodomy became an act of gross indecency, which helped protect the young children who were being born forced into sexual activities. Joseph Rowntree committed to the welfare of the workers at his factory. Improving their working conditions, he also introduced an occupational pension scheme, as well as providing free education, doctors, a dentist and social welfare officer, and a library. By the beginning of the next century, he had created 4 charitable trusts and gave half of his wealth to them. His study and report on pauperism in England and Wales in 1865 was a statistical study on the links between crime and poverty. Charles James Booth believed that the main cause of poverty were illness, unemployment and age, and that he must make a change to their lives. He started his own inquiry, Life and Labour of the People in London, which prompted government to act against poverty and also contributed to the creation of the Old Age Pension Scheme. Martha Beatrice Webb wrote the Minority Report, which was published alongside the Poor Law Commission in 1905. A social reformer as well as an economist, she believed there must be a living wage, that treatment be available when sick, and a modest but secure income when aged or disabled. John Cadbury was a Quaker who believed that everyone should be treated equally and live in peace. Recognising alcohol as a cause of poverty, he opened a shop selling coffee, tea and chocolate, hoping these products would be an alternative to drinking alcohol. His son George also passionately believed in social reform, that his workers exist in a healthy living environment, so he built his own village for his workers. This set new standards for living and working conditions in Britain in the 19th century. Not mentioned among the philanthropists was Edward Jenner, who changed medicine with the creation of the smallpox vaccine. In 1853, the Vaccination Act made taking the vaccination compulsory for all children in the first 3 months of life. Also not mentioned was John Snow, who observed that cleaning the air didn't prevent all disease from travelling, as per the miasma theory. He believed instead in the germ theory, and observed outbreaks of cholera were in clusters among poor people, identifying the singular water pump the poor used. Compulsory vaccination for cholera was then enforced. Even though the miasma theory proved ultimately incorrect, it did see that there was a connection between decaying matter, dirt and disease, as smells originate from dirt. This encouraged public health reform, particularly through Florence Nightingale, as she was insistent that hospitals were airy, bright and therefore better smelling. In the 1860s, Louis Pasteur correctly proved the link between dirt and disease, confirming the ideas of John Snow and Edwin Chadwick. Now people were more willing to pay their taxes for their local councils to clean up their areas where they lived. Edwin Chadwick's report in 1842 concluded that there were 3 main things needed to improve public health. They were the removal of refuse, an effective sewage system with clean running water in every house, and a qualified medical officer appointed to each area. He challenged the laissez-faire attitude of government. He established that disease was the main reason for poverty and that preventing disease would reduce the poverty of the people. The 1848 First Public Health Act was not enforceable. 1858 was the Great Stink. The River Thames in London festered in the heat of that summer. At first, Parliament put up disinfected sheets to remove the smells and to prevent disease, but the smell was too much, and the ultimate impact of this was to build the sewage system by Joseph Balfour Getty, who was requested by Parliament to take the smells away. The Representation of the People Act of 1867 gave the vote to working class men. Also known as the Second Reform Act, now the government had to listen to the working classes for the first time. By 1875, with the mounting pressure of the scientists and philanthropists who were making representations to the government and the working classes making their voices heard, the government issued the Second Public Health Act 1875. This time it was enforceable, unlike the one in 1848. There were 3 measures the local authorities were forced to act upon from the Second Public Health. They were to supply clean water supply, a proper refuse and sewage draining system, and appoint a medical health officer in each area. Proper housing was desperately needed for families with ventilation and space. The impact of the Second Public Health Act was that housing standards now had to be improved. They were to be spacious with light in each room and a private privy out the back, where the night soil man could access it without entering the property. Water supplies were cleaned up. Food which had added ingredients like sand and dust by scandalous traders were being monitored. Women and children were not allowed to work tediously long hours in factories. Less advantage was allowed to be taken of them. Education became compulsory for certain ages. Towns also had to have street lighting and pavements, and vaccination became compulsory for cholera. The impact of all this was that between 1700 to 1840, Parliament authorised more than 600 acts for new improvement schemes in Britain to change the way the people have been living due to the rapid urbanisation. Different acts came into being to combat the problems. The Sanitary Act of 1866 made it compulsory for the local authorities to appoint sanitary inspectors to improve the unsanitary conditions so many were living in. Local authorities became responsible for clean water, sewage systems and the removal of slum dwelling. Sir John Simon, who was a pathologist, surgeon and health reformer, was instrumental in bringing about this act. Although this was expected in the 1848 Public Health Act, it had only been permissive, whereas this was compulsory. The Artisans' Dwelling Act 1875 effectively allowed the local authorities to clear slum dwellings. This resulted in people losing their homes, and the displaced people moved to other areas, causing even further overcrowding. This did not properly address what was to happen to these displaced people. The 1882 Artisans' Dwelling Act aimed with mixed success to improve the procedures for purchase, demolition and rehousing. The 1890 Housing of the Working Classes Act addressed many of the failings in the earlier acts. Using this act, councils attempted to improve the lives of the working class Londoners by choosing to build quality housing for the workers. So many different factors made all of this possible. The nature of rapid urbanisation brought an impact on public health that changed the lives of millions, and these changes we still benefit from today.